And over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Ian. Well, yeah, this is exciting for me to speak to people, through Zoom, but like across the pond, as it were. I was saying to Ian before you guys were all here that we're relieved in the UK because it's now warmer than it has been, and it's been cold here. But our idea of cold, as you probably know, is kind of like 5 degrees. So we're lightweights by comparison with you guys. Um, but yeah. So just a little bit about what I've been doing as in terms of practice as a pioneer. So I arrived in Poole in 2008, so nearly 17 years ago. And in those days, there was some money around in the Diocese of Salisbury, where I am, to appoint some pioneers. And so I was appointed initially only for 3 years, or 3 years funded, to start something and to start something amongst people who perhaps wouldn't naturally engage with traditional church. So we set out to try and create some communities amongst people with little or no background with traditional church, and that developed a community called Reconnect, which is now four missional communities networked across the town. Still relatively small, still relatively fragile, but definitely punching above their weight in terms of the engagement that they have with their local communities and journeying with people who are exploring faith. Um, and then I handed the leadership of that over in around 2017, I think it was 2018, pre-COVID anyway. That's certainly one of those markers in time. It was definitely pre-COVID. And then I was developing Pool Missional Communities, which was the charity that oversaw Reconnect, as a space for others to come and pioneer in. And others have come along and started various things. So we've become a kind of hosting space for new things, and working with the deanery and the diocese here around um, pioneering and supporting others, and I guess a kind of thinking around what does it mean for us to be a mixed ecology of church. So yeah, and I've done quite a lot of thinking, reflecting on these things. I've written a few books. I wrote a book that came out last year with Canterbury Press, which I think is available in Canada through Barnes and Noble. Was that? Yeah, that would make sense. Called In the Fullness of Time, and that's sort of reflecting on a lot of these issues around responding to decline and continuing to seek to be a Christian witnessing presence in in the context that we find ourselves in, but in this very different post-secular context. So what I'm going to do is I'll share my screen. I think Ian wanted us to engage with the questions of how to listen to one's community, how that connects with sort of reimagination, missional imagination, and a final thing on some quite practical things around building a team to explore contextual, uh, starting a new contextual ecclesial community. So I'll try and address each of those in turn and maybe pause at the end of each one of those for a chance for us to ask questions and have a bit of a conversation. And I think we're going to have a break after about an hour. And then I've got some questions that might be helpful for us to explore in groups for a bit after that. So that's kind of the shape of the time. Okay, let me share my screen. Oh, didn't want to do that. Okay, all right. There we go. Okay, so listening to your community. So the first thing is that all is that, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that big picture of a nightingale? Great. Um, why do we need to listen to our community? Um, in other words, what's our motivation for listening? Well, it seems to me that sort of being attentive before action has a good biblical basis for a start. So you might think of um, Nehemiah surveying the walls of Jerusalem, or you might think of the way Jesus engages people in dialogue. There's always that sense in which he's willing to listen um, before assuming that a certain action is needed. So that lovely bit in Mark chapter 10, verse 51, where he asks a person, "What do you want me to do for you?" Likewise, the women at the well in John chapter 4, there's a sense of dialogue rather than this sort of wading in with an assumption of what that person needs. So it seems to me with Jesus, there's this sort of posture, there's this posture of attentiveness to the person and an openness to deeper understanding that is in dialogue with any ability or desire to act in some way. And then Acts 17, famously, Paul in Athens, waiting for others to join him, walks the streets of Athens in order to understand the culture around him. And he says in verse 23 of Acts chapter 17, "I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship." And then he says, when he gets to the Areopagus and he has this opportunity to speak, he references the poets. He says, "As some of your poets have said." So it feels like he's done his research, he's walked around, he's listened, he's been attentive, he's been to the local library, he's pulled out some poetry, and he's really trying to understand this culture that he finds himself in. And shapes the message that he gives at the Areopagus in response to the listening that he's done. Um, but listening, is a value, I think, that we would want to embrace in our engagement with people. To understand, we need to listen. To listen, we need to be attentive. And to be attentive, we need to love. So Sarah Savage says the experience of being listened to well is as close to the experience of being loved as to be barely indistinguishable. So pastorally, we would want to uh, be in a disposition, a posture within our community that allows us to listen as an act of love. And when we listen out of love, we listen, seems to me, without a prior agenda. We don't listen for something because that, to a greater or lesser extent, dehumanizes people. It says we're listening because we kind of already have the answer. We already have some response to the need that we've already felt that you have. So to genuinely listen out of love, we listen without an agenda. There's nothing utilitarian about our listening. It's not for something. And this is where so in that sense, it's non-instrumental. And this is where the picture of the nightingale comes in for me. I'm a bird watcher. And you often hear a bird before you see it. And my bird watching certainly came on leaps and bounds when I started learning bird calls. It sort of opened up a whole new world of being able to be attentive to the birds that are around you. And the thing about bird watching is you find that you inevitably get a bit competitive about wanting to see rarer and rarer birds. And so inevitably you go to certain habitats to listen and watch for certain things. But if you're not careful, you start listening for those things that you really want to hear. Um, and suddenly, because you're kind of listening for something in particular, not really listening, you're not truly being attentive, and you're not open to the surprise of hearing something that you didn't expect, or as open as you might otherwise be. So, I use that metaphor just thinking, well, in what way are we listening to our community? Are we listening with an end in mind? Or are we listening with an openness to the totality of what is there, the questions that people are asking, rather than the questions that we think they should be asking? And are we listening with an openness to surprise, for our communities to tell us things that we genuinely didn't expect to hear, and that disrupt our thinking and open us up to new ways of being and doing in our communities. Another metaphor I use for this is map making. So we're familiar with maps, and we're familiar particularly with grid maps. So, the maps that we have generally to get to navigate around the world are those maps that are worked out by a sophisticated grid. And the idea of grid maps emerged around the same time as the rise of modern science. And they're really useful. But there kind of are dangers, it seems to me, with those sorts of maps because they sort of tend to reduce complexity and mystery, and they invite us to think that this map that has kind of reduced and simplified the world around us into this two-dimensional picture is the way things are. And it also sort of seduces us into thinking, therefore, we can navigate our way easily through this complexity. And we can also kind of make this place do what we want it to do or provide for us what we want it to provide. So we can look at such a map and kind of more easily get what we want out of it or get what we want out of the place that it represents. But prior to grid maps, there were sort of more oral maps that are about the story of a place that kind of were drawn and recorded, things that had happened or experiences from the community. So maps were formed from the places where life happened and where historical events had happened, and they told a story of a place. And those sorts of maps, it seems to me, keep us rooted in the relationship between people and place, and they don't reduce place to mere resource. And I guess I want to suggest that the kind of maps that we need, or that we would want to cultivate for missional engagement with our communities, are more like the latter than the former. We might need a bit of the former, those sort of grid map kind of things. But if we lose the relationships and the history and the story and the soul of a place that you get from that kind of more kind of oral way of understanding a place, I think if we lose that, I think we have lost something really important about how to be missionally attentive and engaged in a place. So I call those cartographies of love. Somehow being able to listen attentively to a place and map it in a sense, but through a lens of love. Um, so we need to listen with openness and to surprise and the potential for people and place to reveal something of the mystery of a place to us. So not us giving what we think is needed to a community, but rather engaging in a dialogue with our community that in which we are open to something quite surprising from it. And Eugene Peterson refers to community almost like the soil of our context. He says, like the farmer with his soil, I must respect and honor and reverence it, be in awe of the vast mysteries contained within its unassuming ordinariness. I love that sense of awe and wonder at the topsoil, the community before us, which is a very different kind of attitude to one, perhaps, with industrial farming, where we almost see the topsoil purely as a resource to generate what we need or want from it. So that's my kind of why we listen to the community, but how might we listen to our community? So I'm just going to go through a number of methodologies or things that people do as part of a whole process of listening to our community, and they're not in any particular order. The first one is prayer. When we started here in Poole, we did a lot of listening. In fact, I sort of committed to doing a year of listening, which a lot of people found quite strange at the time. And all sorts of people said what I should do almost the moment my feet landed on the ground. And I gently pushed back and said, actually, I'm not going to do anything for a year, which surprised a lot of people because they expect pioneers to be sort of activists who just sort of hit the ground running. But I really felt the need to listen, and and I needed to clear space to listen. And in order for me to clear space for listen, I needed to resist the the tendency to just find to just to be active and do things. But yeah, it started with prayer, um, walking around the community and praying, and also gathering with others to pray and praying myself. That's I mean, lots of ways of praying. It's not sort of saying there's a particular way to pray, but it seems to me that prayer is a fundamental thing about listening to what our community is saying, what God might be doing in our communities. The second thing, I don't quite know how to describe this. I put personal immersion, which sounds like something to do with baptism, which it isn't. It's more that we that what we need to do, and we may well be that may be the case for us already, particularly if we've been in a community a long time, is immerse ourselves in the community. You know, a community is the sum total of all those relationships and conversations that are taking place in a neighborhood or you know whatever that community is. And in order to listen, we need to be part of that conversation. And so we're kind of, if we're coming from outside, as I did when we came to Poole, I was looking for a way in. Of course, there are lots of different communities in the area that I'm in. It's not like one community. There are other parts of Poole that feel like quite coherent communities, particularly some of the social housing estates in different parts of the city. So it's also kind of recognizing how many communities there are, and you may never get to the bottom of that question. But we can't listen unless we're part of those conversations and part of those relationships. And so I guess it's personal immersion because very often it's something about who you are that kind of as a pioneer or as a missioner that gives you a way in to certain conversations and certain communities. So one of the earliest things that we did in Reconnect was engage with a whole bunch of people who through craft and art because we met as a community and we were only 10 adults at the time. And we said, well, who are we? What have we got that we can offer into this community? And we discovered that three people within that initial group were felt makers, which seemed quite surprising because it wasn't something that many people knew anybody else did. And there were three of them in the group. So they started engaging by going to staff craft groups and then starting to invite people to specific felt making workshops that one or two members of the community led. But it meant that they were getting to know people, they were building relationships, they were becoming part of the conversation of the community, and there were lots of other examples of how that took place. Um, then there's one that I guess a lot of us have already heard of, people doing research surveys, you know, mining government data, local histories. One of the things that I did is I went to the local library and I asked for every single map of Poole that they had in the local library. And I remember I was on this one of those big tables and the long-suffering local librarian got out every map and brought them and I put them all out. And it was a really powerful moment because it just sort of said something about the story of Poole as it moved from this tiny, small port and began to expand ever outwards from there. But also just seeing the changes and getting a sense of what the story of the place was. So, I mean, that was quite a narrative way of using, you know, local data. And there are much more, perhaps more quantitative ways of using local data, but there's a lot of data out there which we can use to understand both the story and the sort of, you know, what kind of a place we live in. And then this other one, experimentation. Ian will know a bit about this because the research I did towards my doctorate that I'm about to finish involved listening to some of the pioneers that Ian was involved with in Southwark Diocese. And one of the things that struck me from those interviews was how many pioneers are using experimentation as a way of listening. So I'm a bit more contemplative, and I'm a real um, I'm really positive about kind of, as I said earlier, kind of resisting doing too much initially and listening attentively, contemplatively, to the community and to what the Spirit might be doing within it. But some pioneers are a bit more active and they want to do stuff. Um, but they're doing things at a scale that means that they can listen through their experimentation. And if and the experimentation is helping them learn about the community and helping learn about what sort of connections between the community and the Christian faith, Christian practice, might maybe have some resonance in that place. Um, and yeah, and in some ways, I'll tell you a little bit about that later. There are, I realize now on reflection, ways in which I used experimentation in my early days in pool as well. The idea of the person of peace, which you may have come across, rooted in the Gospels, the idea that we're looking for somebody who can kind of be that point of contact through which there is, in a sense, a gateway to the relationships in the community. So finding that person of peace who will be perhaps more suited because they're already rooted in that community and already have relationships in that community, will be in a place to be able to open up a community to new relationships. What's in your hand? Yeah, I mean, I've already told you that story from our early days. We had three felt makers, and so through that, they were able to, join in with the conversation and relationships of the community. So it just seems to me very often something within the initial pioneer or the small community that they're part of at the beginning will provide a way in to listening and learning from the community around them. And time. I mean, I've already alluded to this, in deliberately giving ourselves a year before we started doing something. I don't think, but I just don't think if you're going to listen in a way that's like this idea of the cartography of love, of doing it at the speed of love, you can't do it quickly, particularly if you're moving into a community, a new context or a new community for the first time. This takes time, and our church culture wants results very quickly. And I think part of my instinct to resist that, what are you going to do? Almost the moment that I landed was that it was quite instinctive at the time, but a sense that listening needed to take time to be done well. Um, so I think that's really important. And then finally, through all of this, a kind of process of theological and practical reflection. So kind of interweaving through all of these different ways of listening, the need for reflection, um, journaling, conversations with other people, using, as it were, the wider church to help reflect on what we're hearing, and the connections that might be being made between what we're hearing and the life and witness of the church. So to sort of ground this in practical reality, I thought I'd tell you the story of Workspace. So this is one of the things that we did in the early days when I was in Poole. So Central Poole, where I am, is a residential community. It's a focus for tourism and business, but there's also quite a number of large employers here. So we have the headquarters of the RNLI, which you might have heard of. Barclays Bank has a big presence here. It was until recently a unitary authority, local authority in the area, so employed quite a lot of people in local authority public service. So I thought to myself, if we're going to connect with people in this place, what would it look like to connect with people who are coming into Poole or living in Poole and working in Poole, but what would it mean to connect with people in the workplace? And as I said, I did this listening year. And that was one of the things I noticed, that there's lots of large employers in Poole. And then I started doing a bit more active listening. I too eventually succumbed to the need to do things. But what I decided to do was a bit more of a kind of listening project. And I did a series of one-to-one interviews with 30 people. And I asked them, I wanted to explore kind of this sense that people are actively spiritual without necessarily exploring that in any institutional religious kind of way. So I asked 30 people whether they had a sense of God, how they experienced God, and if they did, what did they do to sort of explore that experience of God, and what help they might need in exploring that sense of God. And so what was really interesting is that 50%, I mean, it wasn't a huge survey. It probably wouldn't, meet some methodological standards of research, but it was interesting. 50% of those people said they emphatically said they had a sense of God. They experienced God in some way. And of those 50%, most of them, I think it was about 80% of the 50%, then said that they prayed or meditated. That was how they engaged that's how they explored this experience of God. And the other thing that it said which was interesting, was that they really wanted to maintain a kind of individuality in that exploration. They weren't likely to engage with institutional forms of religion to explore it. They were much more likely to go on the internet or read a book or meditate on their own or whatever. Anyway, it just seemed to me that at the time that we had resources in the tradition of the church, that had the potential to meet people who were exploring spirituality, in this very individual, but very often prayerful, contemplative way. And I put that together with this listening that I'd done around workplaces, and began to wonder, well, what would it look like if we offered resources from the Christian tradition, contemplative prayer, lectio divina, silence, in busy workplaces in Poole. And we started with Barclays. I found somebody in Barclays who was willing to work with me and book a room and help advertise it and that sort of thing. And we started this group called Workspace. And eventually we had 3 groups in those 3 different workplaces. And they were always reasonably well attended, about 10 to 12 people. They were always about 50% Christian and 50% people who wouldn't profess themselves to be Christians. We then started running retreats a couple of times a year that anybody who came to a workspace could come to. And we had people come and talk about the monastic life and all sorts of things. And it was really rich. And a number of people came to faith through that. And one of them has now got ordained in the Church of England. And obviously there's all the things that I don't know about, but those are some of the things that I do. We weren't able to sustain it, sadly, so Workspace doesn't exist anymore. But it's a good example of how listening, I think, brought a rich, imaginative connection between different things that I was hearing at the time. I'm gonna stop sharing at that point, and wondering if there's anything that anybody wants to ask or reflections that they want to offer at this stage.
Yes.
Jeff.
Paul, you just said that the workspace wasn't sustainable. Was there a particular reason why? In other words, the person leading it suddenly moved on to something else. There wasn't funding. People stopped coming. What was the reason, or was there a reason?
Um, I think there are a number of reasons. So I was fine. I was running around 3 different workspaces, running it myself, which wasn't sustainable. So I found some funding for somebody else to join me, and they helped run them for a bit. My vision, as it were, my hope was that you could find people within those workplaces who would be willing to run these groups and kind of host an emerging community in their own workplace. That proved really difficult to pull off. People really liked the fact that you came in from outside and ran a group because they're exhausted just doing their job. And so lunchtime, half an hour at lunchtime, with somebody else coming in to host a space like that was a gift. So the sort of more sustainable way I thought we could run it with volunteers, lay ministers, as it were, within those workplaces, we couldn't achieve. So we got some funding for somebody to run it, and then I couldn't find ways of sustaining that funding either. So yeah, it was a shame, but I guess those are the reasons.
Thank you.
You know,
Paul, you had mentioned that when you were doing your research beforehand, a year of listening, that you kind of surveyed that 50% of the people were interested in some sort of spirituality, and 80% of them actually prayed or meditated to experience God. But you said that they like to do it individually, which makes me think that people generally consider prayer, meditation, that type of thing, a private matter. And that might be a wrong assumption, but that's what I'm thinking. But the second thing is, how did you move people from that individual private stance to a communal form of prayer?
Yeah, I mean that research, I'd love to have kind of pursued it more, but it was a listening exercise, and for me, the sort of fruit of it was in where that led. With things like workspace, I didn't necessarily work with those people that I talked to myself beyond that. So yeah, so the second part of your question, I can't really answer, but it's a really good one. I think a lot of people are wrestling with that. This kind of um, Charles Taylor. I don't know if you've heard Charles Taylor, talking about that kind of authentic, that individual authentic quest that so many people are engaging in our post-secular age. And yet, for me, it seems to me that people are craving community as well. So there seems to be a kind of really interesting dilemma and paradox there that a lot of us are wrestling with. I haven't necessarily got the answer, but I think you're absolutely right in that assessment.
any other questions?
Of course, you will have heard of Charles Taylor. He's Canadian, isn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've pushed him quite heavily with some of the things we've been doing as well.
Yeah. Great.
Particularly those thinking about parishes and the disconnect between parishes and neighbourhood and listening. I just wondered if you had any particular questions from a parish perspective, particularly for those of you in very large, busy churches. And there's a few of those here. When I say very large, I mean more than 20 people. No? Okay.
I can ask a question. So, you know that you talked about the year that you spent listening and how there was like people are like, why aren't you doing something? It's interesting because when you're a missioner or like a pioneer, which we call missioners here, there's like, and you're in a new project, there's more of an opportunity to do that. Whereas I think for many parish clergy, it's like you don't just get to go, okay, this is the year I'm spending listening, and all of us are listening because there's like so much else that has to go into ministry, especially considering so many of our clergy are part-time now, like even at some few on this call. So what would you say about what does that look like? Like, let's say our parishes, I'm the parish development missioner, so working with lots of the parishes. Like, let's say our parish is like, yeah, we really seriously do want to do this listening. This is very, very important for us. But we're still expected to have, 2 Sunday services and do outreach that we're doing. Like what would you recommend? Like, how do we, it's a tough question, but like, how do we do that kind of important listening when we have so many other priorities and job expectations on us?
Yeah, it is a tough question. And we've just been doing some work with the diocese here about leadership for innovation and mission. And one of the big themes that has come up is what we call space and spaciousness. How do we create space for leadership for innovation and mission? When, as you say, the majority of these missioners or pioneers are in a parish context where there's a lot of demands from the existing, traditional church services and occasional offices and all those sorts of things. So I mean, yeah, it's about, I guess it's about priorities. I mean, we can come on to this later when we talk about team, finding people who have that vision and call to venture into these spaces and listen, and giving them the space to do that. And as parish clergy, that very often means advocating for that, advocating to the wider parish or the wider church community why this is important, why this person is doing it, why they're not doing all the other things, what the benefits of it might be. So sort of telling that story that helps people to begin to trust that this is worth doing, rather than, well, why aren't they doing all the other things that need doing? And that, the experience of most pioneers or missioners is that is a constant tension. It's a constant, and I want to use the word battle, but dialogue is maybe a better word. It's a constant dynamic and not always an easy one. And I don't think we can escape that because of the nature of the things that have accumulated through our traditional practice. But if we aren't willing to slow down and listen, and make space for it, then we are not going to be able to participate in the new thing that God might be doing. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Perhaps one more question. I can't remember who was first, but maybe we can listen to ask. Yeah, and then we probably ought to move on. Berman.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, would you please let me know a little bit more about personal immersion, because that's a big deal to me, because you linked it, it's prayer, personal immersion, and then experimentation. So for my own self and for helping somebody, for example, who wants to start being a commissioner missioner. So that I want you to please a little bit more about that.
I mean, I think it might sound like a sort of fancy thing. I didn't know what else to call it really, but it's something about the personal, very often the things that people enjoy doing, the things that give them a way of connecting with people. So to give you an example, I was talking to a pioneer again in Southwark Diocese as part of this research, and he just liked playing football, and he went along to the local football club and got to know people through football, and eventually got invited to be the club chaplain. And it's through those natural connections that you have through the things that you enjoy doing and the things that you enjoy talking about that enable you to sort of become part of a conversation. So, and I think it's just recognizing that's a gift, that's an attribute that's worth embracing and celebrating, as a way of engaging with the relationships and conversation around us. Okay, should we move on? So, sorry, I think it was Jeff who had a hand up, but time is already against us. Let me just share my screen again. So moving from listening to sort of growing in our missional imagination. I mean, fundamentally, I think imagination is a gift of the Spirit. It's participating in the Spirit at work in the world, that we begin to connect with the reimagination that the Spirit brings. And I use this picture of birds again, but I use this picture of an osprey carrying a stick, and clinging on for dear life on the stick is a blackbird. And I saw this on Twitter, and I just thought it was a really interesting image, because it seems to me that very often the church thinks it's the osprey, and it's desperately hoping that in its powerful, movement towards whatever its purpose, whatever its project, whatever its vision is, the Holy Spirit will will come along for the ride. But I think our theology would be better if we saw the Osprey as the Holy Spirit and us as quite a meek, fragile, humble church clinging on for dear life and hoping to keep in the flow of the Spirit. So John V. Taylor said, our theology would improve if we thought more of the church being given to the Spirit than the Spirit being given to the church. And he said, mission means to recognize what the Creator Redeemer is doing in his world and to try and do it with him. So that's John V. Taylor from The Go-Between God, which is a beautiful book. So, this is, in a sense, basic kind of Missio Dei theology. But it has some pretty radical implications for how we go about doing mission. And one of the things I found, a book that I found really, really helpful in my thinking, in my thinking about for my doctorate, but thinking about what does it mean to participate in the Missio Dei, and therefore what does it mean to participate in a way that helps us engage with a reimagination, or an open, be open to the imagination that the Spirit brings. Is a book by Ben Quash called Found Theology: History, Imagination, and the Holy Spirit. And his basic idea, which is encapsulated in this quote, the perfection of God's revelation in Christ is not compromised by, indeed precisely implies, an ongoing historical dynamic whereby in God human beings are constantly invited to relate the given to the found. So this idea of the given and the found, this dynamic between the given, or what we receive through the tradition of the church, through Scripture, in dynamic conversation and relationship to the found, what we find in our context as we go about our listening, as we walk into our community, we find things that challenge, provoke, affirm, what we've been given through our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ. So I think he's saying that revelation is not entirely fixed, but is this dynamic. It's this dynamic in history and in context. And I think, you can see that, for example, in the book of Acts, where there's this constant conversation throughout the book between the given, initially the Jewish system of religion, and the found. Initially the foundness is the revelation of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, the revelation of Jesus as the Son of God, and then as the book of Acts continues, the revelation of, gosh, the Holy Spirit is at work amongst the Gentiles, and that completely disrupts the early church thinking of itself as a sect within Judaism and the Council of Jerusalem, etc., etc. So there's this, even just in the book of Acts, you can see this constant dynamic between the given, what's assumed to be true, and the found as the Spirit moves the church into new contexts throughout the story of the book of Acts. So Ben Quash talks about, I love this phrase, the in-betweenness of the Spirit. This is essentially a kind of, it's a pneumatology. It's an understanding of how does the Spirit work in the world and how can we participate in what the Spirit is doing. And there's a mystery about that. John 3:8, the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. We're familiar with these verses, I'm sure. John 16, verse 13, when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. The Spirit will take what is mine and make it known to you. So seeking to participate in the Missio Dei is to trust in this mysterious generative presence of the Spirit at work in the world. And what John B. Taylor, but also Dan Hardy and then Ben Quash call the in-betweenness of the Spirit So the Spirit is in the midst of our world. It's in the midst of our relationships. It's in the midst of community, connecting, bringing recognition, bringing newness. But Quash and Dan Hardy, who I'm a great fan of, also talked about the towardness of the Spirit, that actually the Spirit is drawing all of creation, drawing the church towards the fulfillment of the kingdom. And so it's always sort of creating the church anew as the church journeys through history towards the end of time. But the point is that it's participating in that in-between and towardness of the Spirit that constantly keeps the church sort of in a humble, open posture to the new, to an openness to the Spirit reimagining things through our life in the world. So it's like participating in the Missio Dei is I've got the normative church as we kind of think it is, the assumptions that we bring to that. Some of those might be conscious, some of them might be not, and the context. So is this dynamic between the given and the found. And what I've been wrestling with a lot is the tendency that we have, I think particularly in the modern Western church, is to take what we understand about the normative church and apply it in quite a linear, unreflective, sometimes unreflective fashion to the found. So we know the answer here, or we know the form of church that we need here, or we know what we need to do here, and we therefore apply it, in a quite a linear fashion to the context. But if we genuinely believe that the Spirit is at work in our communities, we're bracketing out, by doing that, we're bracketing out all sorts of potential for disruption and for openness and for imagination and creativity of what the Spirit might be inviting us into. And it seems to me that the relationship between the given and the found, between normative church and context, is much more dynamic. It's kind of like this spiral of the church listening and experimenting and engaging and praying and reflecting on that engagement through time. And that through that process of engagement and listening and experimentation, seeking to participate in the Missio Dei, the new emerges. And it might emerge in an imaginative, creative way that we would never have predicted. And so there's every reason to think that something like this, which is a journey of engagement with our local community, has a place within the mission of the church. So very often the sort of classic church planting, I say classic, but the church planting that I used to be involved with and still takes place and has a place within the church, the sort of model where we prepare to plant a church and we start from day one with a worshiping community. So moving from left to right on these circles. We start from day one with a worshiping community. We're exploring discipleship amongst that group of people, and our engagement with our context is predominantly through programs of love and service that draw people into that worshiping community that we started. And we might do that, and so that community gets bigger, and we might do that again by planting another church further down the road, or in a different community altogether. And if I found this language helpful to sort of make sense of that we start with belief that there's a very clear distinction between those who are part of the church. They belong through that process of believing, and we then express our faith through programs of love and service. Michael Moyner, who's a writer that you might have heard of, who's worked in the UK, reflecting on the journey of fresh expressions, makes the distinction between the worship first journey and the serving first journey. So this is a different kind of way in which he saw the church, particularly through the ministry of fresh expressions, new fresh expressions of church engaging with their community. And that here we start with listening. So you're obviously beginning to see that this connects much more with what we were talking about earlier. Starts with listening, then begins to develop into loving and serving on the basis of that listening. And that through that loving and service begins to build community. And through that building of community, there may be those who start to ask questions about the Christian faith, in which case there are opportunities to walk with people in exploring discipleship. And out of that, a church perhaps begins to take shape. Now, he's very clear that it's not, a stepwise linear journey in his writing. He says sometimes the steps get mixed up and one overlaps another. It's probably messier than this. But it's a helpful way of kind of inviting and conceptualizing a different kind of relationship between the church and the community that opens up a much greater degree of conversation, so that discipleship can be explored in a much more contextual way, and that church can take shape in a much more contextual way. And I just thought I'd throw this at you because it's kind of where I've got to in my thinking around this whole, what does it mean for us to participate as a church in the Missio Dei, from the research that I've done with pioneers in the UK. Because what I found is that pioneers are very often saying, well, this is one of the phrases that I took from the interviews that I did. They wanted to create spaces where we just have conversations. They were very conscious that so often the church came with an agenda, as we were talking about earlier. What would it mean for us to, they were looking for spaces and creating spaces where we can just have conversations and build relationship with people. And so, and that rather than, sorry, just go back a bit. And that rather than this sort of process of listening and serving and building, growing discipleship and forming church happening in a linear way. I recognize that Michael Moyner was careful to say that often didn't, but that model has sometimes, I think, been taken to assume that it does. That rather than that happening in a linear way, it happens in a really messy way. And that these elements of listening that we talked about earlier, so the pioneer and their team's ability to sort of immerse themselves in the presence of a place, prayer and listening and spiritual discernment, practical experimentation, trying stuff out in a small scale and willing to adapt or even stop something if it wasn't engaging in any particular way. Constantly reflecting on the degree to which this is engaging with scripture and tradition. These things are all happening in conversation with one another. They're happening in quite a messy way. And that it's a dynamic that's working together rather than in a particular linear way, but that somehow through the conversation between all of these things, pioneers find that they're participating in the Missio Dei, and things begin to emerge out of this conversation. And again, they begin to emerge in ways that often are very surprising. They never imagined that this would emerge, but it has. And actually, it seems to me that element of surprise, of something that generated from this conversation in context that surprises the church, is a good indicator that you've actually participated in what God is doing, rather than just brought your own ideas and imposed them on a place. So I just wanted to give one story, and again, it's a story I think that Ian will have heard of because it's one of the pioneers that he worked quite closely with in Southwark Diocese. Hang on a sec. So one of the pioneers that I spoke to was working on quite a deprived estate in South London, and they started in lockdown. And that gave them, he said, an excuse not to do very much because they literally couldn't do very much because everybody was locked down. So that was a deliberate constraint on their activity, and it enabled them to listen in a really constructive way. The lead pioneer got involved in residence groups and a sort of community, local community committee, which meant that he was really getting to know some of the needs of the community, as well as getting to know people in personal relationships. And out of that, they started a community meal. And the community meal started going really well. Lots of people were coming to it, and the local authority was saying to them, "Hey, this is great. How about we give you a load of money so you can really run this at scale?" And they said something which to me is really significant. They said, actually, we don't want to do that, because they were worried that if they did that, it would be the church running a community meal for the community rather than with the community. They wanted to create a community that had that space for conversation and meeting people, on a level playing field, as it were. So that's what they did. The community meal continued, relationships and community started to continue to grow. And then they started to offer, it was, through some prayer and discernment, they decided to offer Christian meditation groups. And initially these kind of struggled in terms of engaging with people, but they adapted it and adapted it again. And gradually people started to come regularly to these contemplative prayer groups. And then they found that the discussion after the contemplative prayer groups was getting so heated and so kind of, dynamic, that they needed to create another space for these conversations to really have their own space. So they developed some Bible discussion groups. And when I spoke to the guy that was leading this, which is going on for 2 years ago now, so it'd be interesting to know where it's got to since then. But he described church forming through these various spaces. So he found that some people had begun to want to explore their faith more deeply by going to church, and had started going to the church that started this ministry in the first place. For other people, the Bible discussion group was their way of exploring discipleship. There was kind of a sense of a sort of fluid ecology of church as people were growing in discipleship through these different spaces. So some were going to traditional church, and others were finding their discipleship growing within the groups that had started on the estate. But the interesting thing that he said was that what had happened had surprised him. It had taken a form that he could never have expected. And this ministry of participating in the Missio Dei had taken it to places that he would never have predicted when he first started. So, I think it's a lovely story that, for me, sort of provides a sort of expression of this quite messy and emergent way in which just new disciples and the beginnings of a church begin to form through this practice of following the Missio Dei. So a final slide, and then we'll stop. This is my little model, but the given the normative church is engaging with context of found. It has to sort of let go of some of its assumptions. It has to let go of knowing the answers, or knowing the model of church that's needed in this place, and engage in this quite humble, uncertain, unpredictable process of engaging with the Missio Dei that's at work in a community, and trusting that through that process, through the presence of the Holy Spirit, discipleship and a new ecclesial community will form. But the important role of the existing or traditional normative church is in how do we receive that new community? How do we help this thing that's emerging reflect on an ongoing way? And that's where I think the mixed ecology is really important, because it means that the traditional and the new, the thing that's emerging from innovation, are held together by this mutual desire to reflect on the nature of what is taking place, and that hopefully will be a generous and creative dialogue. Sometimes, unfortunately, it isn't, because there's a certain degree of kind of competition or even disaffection with pioneers and what they're doing. But I think a mixed ecology ought to be able to hold that conversation between tradition and the new, in conversation, so that the new can find its place within the wider church. Okay, I'll stop there. I've said a lot. Should we take a few questions and have a break in?
Yeah, let's take a couple of questions. And maybe invite Jeff if you want to ask the question you wanted to ask earlier, then do ask that now if you want to. Or anybody else got a question as well?
I'm not sure how much of a question it was, other than just to say I really enjoyed the model you were showing at that time, which included all of the listening, but also the idea of experimentation as well as a method of engaging with people, something that we tried in 2024, where we had done a lot of listening, a lot of research, and so on, tried some things. And in that trying process, we learned a lot from the people who were engaged in that to help inform us as to what we could do in the future that might be more engaging, more successful, more sustainable. So that was what I was going to say.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
One question before we have a break. We'll take a 5-minute break after the question. No, you've all got that Zoomitis, I can see it. Okay, well, let's take a quick 5-minute break now. It's for us, it's 6 minutes past 2. Let's just come back in about 5 minutes time. Okay, let's have a quick break. All right, see you in a minute.
It scares them to see that. That's all I was going to say. But yeah, we're going to have to help our normative people become comfortable being in a process that looks like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could what I was thinking of when you were explaining that, Paul, was we had our vestry, which is our annual general meeting on Sunday, and I gave a presentation on mixed ecology, and and then I gave a few examples of what it could look like, but explained how it's contextual and not, you can't just say, let's do that, or we have to do that listening and it takes a long time. And we have some real movers and shakers in the congregation, but they're really good at doing, and they make things happen. And no sooner was the presentation over when a couple of people had said, well, there might be a need for this in the community and there might be a need for that. They already had a solution and said, let's do this. So I could relate to that, driving from the given church to the culture.
Yeah.
Or context, I mean.
I mean, one of the ways that I'm trying to do that here in Salisbury Diocese, because I recognize that what you're doing really is that you're challenging people's, what I call, I mean, this is stolen from Charles Taylor, ecclesial imaginary, what I mean, that really deep understanding of what it means to be the church. That's a sort of summation of both what they think theologically and what they've learned from their experience of church and their practice of it in the present. And you're challenging their ecclesial imaginary, and that can be deeply disruptive and unsettling. It's unsettling, so it's resisted. And it seems to me that one of the things that Jesus did was to challenge people's sort of deep-seated imaginary was tell parables, because they sort of disrupt, they sort of get you into the story. You're participating in something that seems like, oh yeah, we've got this in common. And then suddenly you realize that actually the rug's being pulled out from your feet a little bit. And so I think metaphor and story, yeah, and that's kind of part. This is not a long plug for the book that I've just written, but what I was trying to do in that book is offer some kind of gentle disruption to people's ecclesial imaginaries in ways that didn't, because in the UK, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but it so easily becomes this sort of binary argument about, my way is better than your way, and therefore you need to give my way of being church resources and not your way. And so we lose that conversation that seems to be so important about the mixed ecology. So yeah, trying to use metaphor and story. So, I think mixed ecology is helpful because the ecological metaphor is something we can all relate to. And actually, I think it's a really helpful metaphor to think about church in a new way.
Helpful. Okay, Paul, do you want to continue? and then this next section, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, sure. This will be a relatively short section, and then hopefully there'll be space for group discussion and a bit more conversation. Sorry, that last quote, which I love. So it'd be a shame to leave it behind. Alistair MacIntyre from After Virtue. A living tradition then is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about what are the goods which constitute that tradition. So I think it's a helpful quote to realize that tradition should involve us, in quite robust discussions about the nature of the church as we move into different contexts and through time. So what might it mean very practically to form a team that goes on this journey of listening and participating with the Missio Dei in context? So we talk quite a lot about vision and purpose. So I think it's really important to ask the question, why do you want to do anything, and what's the good that you want to see? And I just think these questions, particularly at the outset, kind of surface some of those assumptions that people bring to what, a new initiative might bring. So when I first arrived in Poole, I was licensed as a pioneer to an area that covered the whole of one parish and parts of two other parishes. So I had the slightly difficult job, or an impossible job really, of being part of three parishes and developing a relationship with three parishes and helping them see that what we were trying to do was part of their mission and part of the church, part of their church as much as it was of mine. And we had some of these conversations, and I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I thought we were doing. And I just remember one day doing this. I think I gave a sermon at the local church, and the church warden came up to me afterwards and said, "So do you mean then that this isn't going to bring people here on a Sunday morning?" And I said, "Well, it would be lovely if it did, but I can't guarantee it." Because I'd explained some of the things that we've been talking about, the relationship for spiritual seekers in the institution, and the sort of process and way that we wanted to engage, that we were interested in making disciples, not necessarily making churchgoers. But in communicating that vision, it unearthed some of those questions. What is the good that we want to see? Are we wanting to renew the church? Bring more people into church so that there are more people in church who give more money and sustain the institution, because certainly in the Church of England, there's a lot of that anxiety around, for which pioneering or church planting or fresh expressions can sometimes seem to be the solution. Or is the fundamental good that we want to see a church that is able to better participate in the Missio Dei, better able to listen to its community, better able to build relationships with community in the name of Christ, and all the rest, all these other things will be given unto you, as it were. So I just think, having that conversation and being able to articulate that purpose is really important. And then values. So the difference between vision and values, I'm sure this is not new to you, but how will you go about pursuing this good? Again, we talked about listening, we talked about not doing anything for a year. That raised some interesting questions amongst people. We were articulating a theology, but we were also articulating some of our values around the incarnation, around discipleship as journeying alongside people. Those sorts of things. We were setting out our stall, really. And it meant that those people who wanted to join us knew what they were doing. They knew what we wanted to try and do and how we wanted to go about it. And I used the story of Gideon, actually, and I did 3 vision evenings at the very beginning where I talked about the purpose of what we were trying to do and the values by which we were trying to do it, and use the story of Gideon. You know how Gideon reduces the number of people in the army to a remnant, as it were. It was a sort of, it was a thing I felt God led me to, and I felt like, we weren't going to start with a large group of people, with quite a small number of people who were really committed to ministering in this way, through listening and participation. So we were a group of 10 when eventually we started together. So yeah, vision and values and strategy. What practical steps are you going to make towards the good that you want to see? I just think recognizing the distinctiveness between those three things is important, and talking about those three different elements together is really important. So how has team developed? And this is not massively well thought through, I confess. It's more kind of reflecting on my own experience and my experience of others, of how teams have developed. It seems to me that the appointment of a leader is key. Somebody to be the sort of curator of a team, to facilitate things, and how they lead is a different matter. I've always sought to lead in a very participative and sort of flat leadership kind of way. But there's no doubt that the appointment of an individual leader is a key element of this process. And as I've mentioned before, the role of the pioneer advocate. So in the work that I was doing with CMS in particular, there was somebody who would work with a pioneer, who'd come to the parish and has now started a really great fresh expression of church about 5-10 years later. But he realized that his role as the parish priest, as the parish incumbent, was really critical to that pioneer growing a team and going about their ministry. And it involved them advocating for the pioneer, like, spending lots of time with the pioneer, affirming them, reflecting with them on the work that they were doing, but also advocating for them to the wider parish, saying why this was a good thing, helping tell the emerging story to the parish, sort of, and being somebody who's got the pioneers back, in order, like we were saying earlier, to try and hold open that space for the pioneer to do what they're called to do, and not allow it to be crowded by the demands of the existing traditional services and so on and so forth. I found generally that leaders grow teams over time. So I spent a lot of time just having coffee with people and building relationship with people, beginning to talk about what I sensed was the vision and how we were going to go about what we were doing. And gradually people began to say, hey, I'd like to be part of that. I know that there are examples where people have taken a team from one church and kind of started, and in that example that I gave towards the end of just before the break, I think 10 people had joined them from the mother church and started this work on this estate. So there are different ways of doing it. But certainly my experience is a lot of pioneers take time, and that listening year, as I say here, it often coincides with that listening phase. Because through listening, you're talking to people, and you're talking to people within the existing, the churches that are in that context as well. And you're beginning to find people who are going, hey, I'm really up for this. What would it be like for me to join you in this process? We found that a public commissioning of the team was really helpful, both for the team, for the 10 of us who started out as Reconnect, in saying this is a thing and you're called to it, and we want to bless you and commission you and pray for you as you start this ministry. And also important to the wider church to say this is something that is now part of the ecology of the church, and we want to to say that it's part of the church. We want to bless it. We want to pray for it, and we want to ask you to keep supporting it. So yeah, that was an important event in the development of our team. And then the other thing I thought about was the importance of sense making. This connects again with the role of the pioneer advocate. But it's important for the team as well. That particularly for the leader, and if there's a pioneer advocate involved, like a parish incumbent, it's something about how you keep that process of theological reflection, and help tell the story as it develops. Because again, that's affirming for the team that they're getting a sense of where this is going, and really helpful for the wider church to see that what is growing, what is developing, what that looks like and how things are going. But it's not just telling the story. It's not just saying this is what we did. It's something about being able to weave that story into the life of the church in that place, and into the longer sort of story of a tradition, so that people can make those connections and embrace the new thing that's taking place. And in that sense, and just finally, I just wanted to show you this diagram, because we touched on this earlier, but this whole thing of team development, it seems to me sits within this engagement with how the church can renew itself and reimagine itself for a new cultural paradigm, call it the secular age or the post-secular or whatever you want to call it. But this is a diagram that tries to make sense of what might call systems change. So that in any system, in any field, where a system is at work, there is a point where that system grows and is fruitful, and a point where it begins to be less fruitful and perhaps even tail off and decline. So that could be education, it could be energy production, or it could be in the church. And this is particularly work done by Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries from the Buchanan Institute. And what they argue is that in any situation of systems change, where one existing paradigm is beginning to morph into another emerging paradigm, what happens is that the creatives, the pioneers, begin to create the new on the edge of the old system. They begin to say, hey, you know what, I think we need to adapt, we need to innovate, we need to reimagine, we need to do things differently. And they kind of move to the edge of the existing system and start doing their thing. And very often they start to network and build communities of practice, and that through their practice, something of the emerging paradigm begins to take shape. But the thing is that there are important roles within the existing system that enable those pioneers and their teams to really do what they do and do it well. And as I say, one is the pioneer advocates, those people who can advocate for the new within the old system, and tell the story and affirm the pioneers. And the other is hospices. Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries talk about hospices, those who perhaps can hold the space of the old, even though it might be in decline. And kind of one of the things I think they do that they do is try and recognize what's really good about the existing paradigm that needs to be carried through into the new. So like I say, this work has been done in lots of, in quote, secular contexts about systems change, but I think it kind of applies to where we are now as a church, and the roles that we might need to see ourselves in as we try and help pioneers build teams and reimagine the church for a mixed ecology. So if the existing paradigm is traditional in our Church of England context, parish church. Is the emerging paradigm mixed ecology? Well, I don't know, but it kind of feels like that's the best phrase we've got to sort of talk about the emerging paradigm. And within that context, you know, the role of many incumbents, I think, will be to advocate for pioneers building teams and allowing new expressions of church to emerge in new contexts. I will stop there. Ian, I've got a few questions. What would you, or we could have a conversation in the round. What would you like to do?
You want to put, why don't you put up the questions, and let's use that as a focus for a conversation.
Okay.
That'd be good. We've got about half an hour, so that would be incredibly helpful.
Here we go.
Dina, did you have a question that you wanted to ask before we get into the questions?
I did, but I can hold it off. If it's not answered by the end, I'll ask it again.
Please, yeah, don't forget it, Dina. Don't forget it.
Okay.
Okay. So how should we do this? Should we take it one bullet point at a time and let's have a conversation? Yeah, so to listen well.
Oops. Sorry.
That's all right. Listen well is to love. What would enable the community you lead to listen well to its context? So I'm thinking that speaks to those of us who are in parishes and those, as a few of us that are in missions. What's your responses to that?
Will I stop sharing for a minute, Ian?
Yeah, let's hold on to that question. Andrew, do you want to kick off?
So we had this brilliant idea to engage the McMaster Research Shop, taking the research approach that you mentioned, Paul, over the summer to engage with the different community service organizations in our geographical area. So everything from the city councilor office to small advocacy groups, etc. They contacted about 15 or 16 different offices several times and got no response. And it's McMaster University calling, it's not the Church of St. John the Evangelist. And so they were quite disappointed to come to the to the results meeting in fall and say, we have nothing to give you other than a bunch of archival information that we managed to find. But part of the conversation was knowing that just about every community service organization in our neighborhood is either too busy or not interested enough to respond to a request about what does the group you serve need, what needs are not being met. If that's a question that they aren't able to answer for one reason or another, that's not bad information for us to have about the state of the community that we live and minister in. It just means that we now have to find a different way to listen and hopefully get some more specifics.
I love the way that you and Dina have started thinking about some sort of experimental thing that could help with that listening. And I think there is something of that nature. Being really careful about the whole attractional model of church thing, though, right? But how do we do something that experimental that helps us listen? I'm aware, Fran, you've had some really challenging situations with that, where you've engaged with experimenting with stuff that's not been easy. Maybe you want to share what you've been learning, Fran, from attempting to engage, because I think that's a helpful story.
I think on a positive note, we because there's a group of about 5 to 8 of us who go on a prayer walk every Wednesday. That part of listening to the community has been going quite well. We're always in a coffee shop, and we end up we have one participant in particular who's unbelievably extroverted. They kind of redefine what extroversion might look like, and they're so genuine. So, you know, a month later, they recognize the person on the street, they remember their name, they remember their daughter's name and the event their daughter was about, and they ask the person, I remember you so and so, how did it go? So it kind of, you know, it's quite striking. But we're only hitting a certain time of day, one day a week, so we get a certain kind of part of the community. So I think as far as the rest of the listening, it's I think Ian might be referring to the meditation. Yes, we had a little chat. So I moved the time today, which I apologize. That's why I ended up being late. I was running it on my own today for the first time because unfortunately the person with me has been quite ill for some time and I couldn't postpone another week. So I went ahead and did it. Forgive me, Ian. But I had this incredible woman come and she said she was fine to do it with just the two of us. I said, if you feel uncomfortable in silent meditation with just me, then by all means, I understand. No. She drove here from Mississauga. She wanted to stay. And the conversation we had, she really enjoyed the silent meditation. I explained I don't have a lot of experience. I was really hearing something you were saying about learning from people that join into things. She gave me so much information on meditation and her experiences and suggested switching from Meetup to Facebook because it's free and this and that. And I thought, oh, I really wish you wanted to join me because I would put you on the team. You are amazing. And I said, you know, some people don't like being in the church. They've told me, could we do this somewhere else? They're not really comfortable. She said she loves churches because she goes deliberately into churches when she saw that it was in a church. That was a real plus for her because she said, there's so much positive energy here. And I've heard that. I've never heard it put quite that way, but I've often heard that about our space here. So she was exciting, but in general, we get either no one or one person or two people. We started off with 9, but most of them didn't come back. I'm not going to give up, but it's just a really slow, long learning curve. I am learning a lot, and we just keep tweaking it here and there. I think I need to have a conversation with Ian to get some more ideas about. But the thing is, the people who've come and have stayed after and talked, I've learned more from them than a lot of the listening out in the community that we're trying to do because they're here for a common purpose. And they did actually come to the church building, although not, you know, with the intention of really wanting to be in a church necessarily. But it's kind of as far as further listening, I would need ideas, and I would love to know how we could be out there more. I think maybe a pub, like an evening pub thing or something like that, where we're a different time of day, a different crowd of people, perhaps. I don't have a lot of other ideas, though, of what we even need. And when I say we, sometimes that's me. There's no real team. There's the prayer team, but that's a sort of its own entity.
I see you being very brave and very immersive, Brian. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Any other questions, responses to that first one? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
I feel like the challenge in many communities. So what would enable the community you lead to listen well to its context? I'm sorry, I have to just say time, and the space to do it, because I just think everybody in my age category, I'm not young anymore, but 30s and 40s are running around looking after families, children, like I'm sorry, but it's like survival out there. It's just survival, like precarious work, all this stuff. So it's interesting because even I think about the third question really intrigues me about how do you form a team to create new ecclesial communities? because I think that's one thing that our clergy do struggle with, not because the clergy don't want to form teams, not because you're unopen to having people join you. You're like, yes, people join me, but like, who are those people that are not the people from that what I did like that scale of, you have the people who are creating the change kind of and leading into the new system. I loved that model that you had. But yeah, like it seems to be, I don't want to say like I'm very positive about this. I'm the parish development missioner. It would be horrible if I said there's no hope in this regard, but because there isn't, there is a lot of hope. But the truth is, even within my own life, I'm exhausted thinking about committing to my own church, who is Andrew Rampton, right there, my clergy person. But I love my church. I love my neighborhood. I live in the neighborhood. I'm exhausted thinking of the idea of like having to listen to my neighbors even more, or yeah, I don't know. I just want to say that that's like a reality. Like doing this during COVID, I think was actually easier than it is doing it now in like with the how the prices are and everything we're doing. So I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer. I'm just going to say like maybe I'm just in a headspace of like wintertime in Canada, which always puts me in a bad headspace. But if you want to ask what would enable the community you lead to listen well to its context, like stable jobs, a lot more money, decent housing. I don't know. There's all these social things that prevent people from having the time to do it, except if you're a paid professional. Sorry if that's negative. It's just my headspace, maybe, but that's what I think. So you talk about the system of the church, but I think there's larger social systems at play that are preventing us from doing this kind of listening or building teams.
Yeah. No, I don't know if there's a sort of implicit question there, but I completely hear what you're saying, Emily. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that this guy called Andrew Root, I don't know if you read any of his stuff, but he talks about the culture of acceleration, and that that's one way of looking at modernity is just how fast everything has got. And as you say, it kind of feels like everybody's just in survival mode just to do the basics. So any kind of invitation to do something, whether it's listening or whatever, feels like feels like you say, kind of feels like an exhausting thing to do. So how do we create space for it? I mean, I don't know the answer. I mean, it's got to involve maybe stopping some stuff. Surely that's the way to create space. Are there things that can be removed from that space that takes energy and time and resource that makes space for other things? I also think there's a lot of listening that is latent, if you know what I mean. Particularly if you've been part of a community for a long time, it's almost like harvesting the listening that's already taken place, rather than doing listening as if you were doing it from square one, from scratch. I mean, a lot of the listening I was talking about. I mean, I came to this community from outside. So I was starting from first base, to use a North American term. So whereas if you've been in the community a long time, and there's people that you minister amongst that have been in the community a long time, there's a lot of information there that maybe just needs surfacing.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so that was me speaking as Emily the individual, not as Emily the parish development missioner, just for the record. But there was something you said when you're talking, Paul, which I think this is what I'm yearning for, is like a kind of listening that is joyful and life-giving to me. Because like I feel a sense of like exhaustion when I think about like another church program where we're intentionally listening. But the thing you said about the soccer club or like the football club, like some way that is connective, that's also like something relational where I can be with neighbors and listen, that is also joyful for me, is something that I can imagine at this point. So I think a challenge we have in many of our situations in parishes and in church life is that I feel there's like an expectation of serving, or of listening or of doing the next thing. But but the part about like feeding ourselves is sometimes like a little bit ignored, or like maybe it's just self-imposed in myself. So it's like the idea that listening or any kind of service could be also like beautiful, like breaking bread together, or like having a walking club, or like playing a game, or like that is much more at this moment, like feels very doable and actually like a relief. So maybe it was my own lack of imagination when I said it's exhausting to think of listening.
Mm.
Man, I think one way of thinking about being life-giving is around the idea of listening and prayer coming together. I think that's a very beautiful thing. And so part of my routine of a day is, when I can, like 2 or 3 times, twice a week now I try to do it, is literally to do a walking prayer around the area, which I think is part of that whole listening thing. And it gets you away from a mindset of scarcity rather than abundance, because when I'm living in fear and stuff, I struggle. But if I turn to the abundance and see that, so there's that stuff about life giving is really critical. I shut up. Good points, Emily, because I think that's what lots of people struggle with, is complete exhaustion. And I get it.
Yeah.
Dina, then Jeff, then Garfield.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact how much easier it is when you actually live in the confines of your parish, right? So, Emily, I know that you maybe you live in your neighborhood, as does Andrew, as does Ian, and so sometimes we try and complicate it, but just being a good neighbor and being friendly to one another, and then that latency, like you've lived in the neighborhood for quite a while, so you organically have that meeting group that has dinner together once every week or whatever. These things just kind of pop up and they're really beautiful, but it's just really being a good neighbor. But there's something to be said about when you live in the neighborhood, then you're just bumping into people at the coffee shops or walking, crossing paths on the streets. And it's sad because we can't all live in the neighborhood that we want to minister in, but it really makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, one of the things I keep saying to clergy, and I think it's really important you hear it. I want to give you permission to get away from the computer, feeling guilty about constantly having to apply for emails, and getting out and go for a walk and prayerfully engage with the context. I really want to encourage you to do that. One of the things I had to do with where I was when I was a rector to do this, I had to say to people, most of you will not get a reply to your emails immediately, and if it's not urgent, it will be 2 days. And that gave me enough space to have the capacity to be able to engage with the relationality of the community a bit more. I think I really hear how hard your jobs are, but I cannot emphasize, I think, how important it is. The relationality of what we do is more and more.
And I think,
sorry,
just to interject just briefly, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get with that shift from a linear, listening and then service and then discipling community to something that's more messy and dynamic. Because the thing about putting it in that linear thing is that we think it's a process, and we think we can kind of turn it into a project. And then the listening becomes a technology. And like you say, Emily, then it becomes something that we have to do on top of all the other things we have to do, rather than seeing it as something that we're part of through relationship and conversation, which is perhaps a bit more natural and more joyful.
Yes.
First, I'll just say, Ian, thanks for giving us that permission. But you and Emily keep sending me important emails, and I feel I can't wait for days to read them and reply to them. But anyway, I wanted to say, first of all, Emily, I totally agree with your analysis or just your reflection. That's what I'm experiencing with people all around me. The irony, though, is at the same time, it's causing anxiety and stress that I think people need to live out through their spirituality to help them be healthier people. And so I think we just have to create as many spaces as we have the capacity to create to listen to people. So I'll just say this, Leslie, great idea to talk about mixed ecology at your vestry meeting. I preached about it before vestry. We talked about it at vestry. It did engage me with conversation after vestry with people who came up and said, well, Jeff, what do you think about I go to the hockey arena and be with somebody who's there with their kid because they don't have time to get together any other time. I said, what a great idea. And then somebody else said, yeah, I was talking to somebody at Sobeys last week. We met each other in the aisle and they were telling me all about this thing that Emily was talking about and how they would love to be part of church, but they just can't seem to figure out how to make it all work. They really miss that kind of community and so on and so on. I'm not sure yet what the answers are. I would love it. I was kind of hoping you guys had the magic answer today, but apparently there isn't a magic answer. But I do think what I was hearing from my own folks on Sunday was just keep creating as many spaces or allow for every opportunity to be a space. That is what they were saying to me.
Garfield.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for the sharing, and also thanks for Dr. Emily. I totally reflected the same thing, you just shared. We're living in a time of, anxiety, exhausting. There's two main. I've been doing the more like church planting missionary work for last 4 or 5 years, at least, and also walked through the pandemic. That was difficult time. The two major spiritual needs I identified most often. One is dealing with the anxiety and all these challenges. People job, very tangible things like Dr. Amy mentioned, raise kids, household, mortgage, all these things. But one thing all of them, there's quite a few already settled in the church. They reflect on oh, why am I so anxious? Is there a way of I can calm myself, become more peace, prayer or anything? Some people step into the church just they find the power of a prayer. We started there and get some people join the mission. That's I think one major spiritual needs I experienced. The other one is reconciliation. It's in the time of difficult, people started, pointing fingers to each other, even in the one family, husband and wife, and kids and parents. All these things happening. Many of them they find that there's hopeless. They go to the psychologist. They go to the consultation. And all this they use even go to medicine. But the last places I encountered quite a few families. They came to church. So I got invited a few of them, please come to pray for us. I know this is a place where we can find the hope. There's maybe a solution there. It's very clear, I think the reconciliation, spiritual needs. This year I prayed hard. I put two brothers, they've been fighting for 10 years, haven't talked for 5 years. I managed them to sit together. I find that's a way of journey. It's the healing power of Jesus is so strong. So this is a two angle I just want to share with the team. Maybe I think that's a way of we started the new ministry or missional journey. But it like Dr. Emily just said, it is hard in our time. You see all these scary things happening around the world, right? Every day. Yeah. That's it.
I think there's something that we haven't really talked about yet, and I think I'm going to park it as something that we need to attend to. And that I really loved all this, Paul, about listening and building a team. But I think what we often think, I think we hold a certain guilt, but I think the cultural forces are so against church, that they're so against the speed of life, living in a market society that we don't talk about very much, is antithetical to a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I think there's something of the Jesse Zink analysis that we'll need to think about. We do live in a world in crisis. Each of your neighborhoods is a crisis. And there's a lot of cultural crisis. And he talks about 4 major crises going on as well. So there's something about that we're seeking to innovate in a time in the world being in crisis is really important to acknowledge, which is why this is hard, right? It's not easy. We're talking about a world that lacks stability. So there's something about how we can sustain ourselves to do this work in a world in crisis, which I think comes back to what Emily said. That's why it's exhausting. That's why it takes time. And there's something about seeking to live out. There's something about a deeper discipleship and a deeper missionality to be able to do this, acknowledging that we're all ridiculously busy in a time of crisis. So I'm really going away thinking about this. Principles are really important, Paul, but I think how do we do that when we have such scarcity at the moment? But that's a good place to start from. So don't feel guilty. I think that, you know, the very fact that you're here, that we're doing this work, we are attempting to do this, says something. And it is not easy. And I think we just really need to just acknowledge that this is tough. And it's going to be tough for a while. I think. So, but anyway, all these truths, thank you for this, Paul. I think we have recorded this. We will make it available for you guys to watch it again. I think there's lots of really interesting things for us to think about. And we'll take it into our practices as we seek to develop things. So any last words you wanted to say, Paul, into the conversation we've just been having before we say goodbye? Because I know you need to.
Well, no, it's just been lovely to meet you, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to engage with what you're doing. And you know, I've learned from many of your insights as well. So thank you, and maybe we'll connect again across the Atlantic. Be great.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
Let me just turn off the lady.